What's up guys? So today we're going to be doing a coilover conversion and just a general suspension overhaul on the 280ZX. So we got a lot to get through in this video, so let's get started. Alright guys, so before we get started, I'm just going to go over a quick review of my plan for these coilovers. These are yellow speed racing coilovers. One of the main reasons I got them, I'll be honest, is because of the gold anodizing on it. But they did have some good reviews, specifically for Subarus was the main one that I was able to find. I couldn't find too many applications of people actually installing them on Datsuns, but I figured they should do fine all the same. So these two right here are for the rear. You can tell that they already have locations just to bolt them directly up. However, the fronts are a little bit more complicated. We're going to have to remove the entire front knuckle assembly and then cut out the old shocks, weld in this tube to the old location, and then we can go ahead and reinstall. Now, the rears do not have camber adjustment. However, the fronts do have these camber plates on them. Now, one of the other things we're going to have to do for that is cut out a large hole on the top of the shocks. So I do have this 3.5-inch hole saw right here. Now that's a fairly large hole to be making and keep it steady. So another thing that I did, fabbed up some little guides that should help me keep everything straight and aligned as I cut. So those kind of just pop into that top hole. I'm probably going to clean out the bottom and then tack weld that in place and then use that as my guide for making the hole. Now, since I'll have everything disassembled, another thing that I'm going to be replacing are some suspension bushings. I got these from Energy Suspension, and so just since I'm going to be in there, I'll swap in new ones. So that's the plan. First thing on the list is just to get everything disassembled. We'll see how easily everything comes apart, but let's get started. So overall, most of the components came out just fine, with the one exception of this rear control arm bolt right here. You can see that I actually was able to break the nut loose, but the bolt, I think it's basically fused to the bushing there. So I've tried many different things. I've tried this ball joint clamp, try and press it out, heat, and nothing really is working. So we're gonna try and cut it out with this oscillating tool and see how it goes. Alright, well that was way harder than it needed to be, but as you can see, we got it all out. So next thing we're gonna do, we're gonna use this ball joint clamp here and just press out the old bushings and press in the new ones. Alright guys, so we have the stock suspension removed and the new coilovers sitting right next to them just for a comparison. So these are the rear right here. These ones, I'm just going to mark down the eye-to-eye length so that I can match it on the new coilovers, and then we can go ahead and throw the old ones out. For the fronts, we're going to have to do a little bit more disassembly just to prep it for the cutting and welding that we're going to have to do on the stock struts right here. I forget exactly where the instructions say to mark out the cut, but we're going to strip it down a little bit more before we get to that point. All right, guys, so like I said, we're just going to be doing a little bit of disassembly on the front here. We're going to be taking out the old springs and the struts and then stripping it down just to make it a little bit easier to make our cut once we're ready. Another thing that I noticed So there's definitely some resistance and a little bit of like grit in my ball joint here. So that's another thing we're gonna end up replacing. And that right there is why you always face ball joints away from you. That thing came out flying. So at this point, everything is disassembled, so we're just gonna wash it in the dishwasher to prep it for sandblasting. Now that everything has been washed on the front assemblies, next thing we're gonna do, I have these assembly instructions right here, and the first thing that it says to do is to mark out 25 to 30 millimeters up on the strut housing and make a cut. That's going to allow us to weld the new coilover base to the old strut housing. And I'm going to go with 30 millimeters. So let's mark it out, make the cut, and then we're going to sandblast and repaint everything when we're done. Alright, so I did some sandblasting on the front spindle and strut housings, and I have it clamped up in the vise right here, about ready to make my cut. You can see my line there at 30 millimeters, so let's get started. Alright, so the strut housings have been cut. It is about ready to all get welded up. So essentially we're just going to sleeve this coilover base onto the strut housing, weld all around, or at least as far as we can get. There might be a little bit of clearance issue once we get around to the backside, but I think we should be able to get most of it. So here's the final product. We have the coilover mount fully welded to the spindle here. I had one of the guys at work weld this up for me just because I wanted to make sure that it was a quality weld. Turns out that this base, the spindle, is cast steel, not cast iron. So that meant that we didn't have to buy any special nickel welding rod or anything. So the next step for these guys, we're gonna end up painting them along with a few other parts, and then I think we will finally be ready to reassemble. So because we have a little bit of extra time, here are all the parts that we just finished washing. For the calipers, I'm going to be sandblasting those and then repainting them gold. And then for any of the other suspension components, control arms, stuff like that, I'm going to be doing like an undercoating on them just to protect them a little bit and clean everything up. All right, guys, so all of my parts have been sandblasted and are about ready for paint. First off, before we start painting, we're just going to spray everything down and prep it real quick, and then on any of the suspension parts like my control arms or tension rods right there, we're just going to do some undercoating. But for the calipers, we're going to be doing this gold caliper paint right here, and then I think just because I had it around, I had this satin clear, I'm going to finish it off with that. So like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, we are going to need to cut a big hole right around our shock towers here. So we're going to use this guide. This is just some, I believe it was 1.25 inch stock that I drilled a 1/4 inch pilot in. So it's basically going to go like that. I think I'm going to weld it from the underside. Just going to take a wire brush, clean that up, and then tack it in place. And then we're going to use this 3.5 inch hole saw. All right, so one hole successfully drilled. It turned out pretty well. There's just maybe an 1/8 inch off from center. But now you can see that I will actually have room for my camber plate adjustment. So next we're just gonna do the exact same thing to the other side. Second hole is all done. So before we finish up here, we're just gonna clean up the edges of both of the holes. And then we're also gonna do a little bit of undercoating on the underside. You can see just a little bit of rust there. And then maybe a little bit of touch-up paint if I need it on the top there. So that's next on the list. At this point, I think we are finally ready to start reassembling everything. So I've been kind of stashing all of my freshly painted parts inside. And before we start to reassemble, I'm just gonna go around just to review what all we're gonna be doing. So we have the rear control arms here, new control arm bushings. Finally got all of my bolts, got some new nuts and washers for them as well. Brake lines, just repainted those real quickly. Got new ball joints and new tie rods, repainted tie rod arms, repainted rotor shields, got some new rotors and new pads, lower control arms replaced with new bushings, sway bar and tension rod mounts painted, tension rods right here repainted with new bushings, repainted the hubs, calipers we repainted, and then we also got some new like seals and such just to refresh those a bit. And then finally we have the repainted, fully welded spindles for the front. All right, so it's a lot of stuff, but let's go ahead and reassemble. So the front is all reassembled. Everything is looking great with the gold. So now we're about ready to install it back in the car along with the tension arms and tie rods. So that's next on the list. Alright, so the fronts are installed. I think everything turned out really nice. I love the gold accents with them, but next up we're going to start on the rear. So I have everything for the rear laid out here. We're just going to do all the final assembly and install. All right, so we're lowered onto the ground and we're definitely high. As cool as it would be for this thing to have 12-inch travel shocks and go off-roading, I don't think that's what we're doing. So we're gonna measure everything out, see how far down we gotta go. It looks like on the front,
Closest thing to the ground is my air dam at about 7 inches. Going over to the wheel from the top of the tire to the fender, got about 5 inches. So I think we are gonna try going down 4. In the rear, I don't know how easy it is to tell, but we definitely have some positive camber going on. And that's just because we're so high right now. As I lower it, the camber should even out. Let's take a look at how much room we got. Looks like around 4 to the fender. So we're gonna try going down 3. All right, so rears are adjusted 3 inches down. It really fits well. I got enough clearance to the fender, at least to the travel of the shock. And I can already tell the stance on this thing is gonna be great, especially once I get the front finished. So that's next on the list. Alright guys, so we are lowered back down onto the ground now, and as you can tell, the stance is a lot better than it was before. Now one other thing we did off camera was we did an alignment with this Gyroline DIY alignment tool. I wasn't able to show it because you actually need your phone to be able to do it. You just zero it off of the wheels and then use those measurements to set your toe, and you can also set your camber as well. So I would highly recommend Gyroline if you're interested in doing a DIY alignment. Now overall, I'm really happy with how the ride feels. We are gonna have to do a little bit of adjustment on the damping right there. Right now I just have it set to the middle of the range, but we're probably gonna go a little bit stiffer than that. Also, we may end up going a little bit higher in the front. You can see that I set it to a 3-inch ground clearance, which isn't a whole lot, and I hit a bump on the highway and this happened. But not to worry, this is actually something we're gonna be addressing in the next video. So if you've heard me mention in any of my other videos that we're gonna do a custom front grille, that's actually gonna be the next video. And then we'll also be addressing any of that air dam area as well. So that's gonna be it for today's video. If you guys enjoyed, make sure to give a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.